Hello, I'm Tara Ruckman.
And I'm Stephanie Howe, and we are Control the Chaos EDU. Are you burnout? Are you feeling frustrated or overwhelmed?
Or maybe it's the opposite and you're a go getter and want to level up. Then it's time to dive in with real talk and solution focused conversations.
Welcome to today's Control the Chaos conversations. And today we're going to be talking about data. And typically we have all this data, right? And then we're like, what do we do with it? And I know for me as a teacher, beginning of the year, it was like I had a checklist, special ed teacher, collect this data point, collect this, collect this, collect this. And I would do all those data assessments because it was on my checklist and I'm a checklist type of person. But then I never looked at it to use that data. So I'd have all this information on this kid, but then the curriculum would come into play or something else would come into play. And I would never go back and really look and kind of analyze that data of what my next steps were for those kids. And I think it was because there was so much of it and it wasn't all in one place for me. So I had data on this sheet that was maybe handwritten. I had this in a Google form. I had this over here in Edulastic. I had all this data everywhere, but it wasn't all in just like a one snapshot view of where I could view it. And so hopefully today we can talk about that roadblock that I had and how I overcame it and how some teachers are overcoming it this year as well. Tara, what was your data like?
Oh, well, my data, I had data binders because I was an IS and it was all paper. And
Mhm.
so that was hard. Like, who does that anymore, right? Like all this paper data. And then, you'd pass your data binders on to the next year, and then it would be more data that you gave to the next year's teachers as they were transitioning, and nobody looked at it because it was a bunch of paper copies. And then you would get emails. Do you have work samples that you used from last year with this kiddo? And you were like, it's in the data binder, but nobody used the data binder because it was so much paper and it was just like stuff everywhere. Um, I mean, of course I used it to drive lessons, but looking back now, like I really thought I was organized, and maybe I was at the time in the moment, but now, like looking back, and I think there's so many different things that I could have done to organize my data, not just use it um differently, and to share it with my team. There's a lot more that I could have done with it when I think about it. So, yeah, looking back, I thought I was on it, and I really wasn't.
Yeah, and I think too, like when you do become an instructional coach, you see all these different classrooms and these viewpoints and how teachers organize or meet with students. And I was like, oh, I wasn't meeting small group to talk about their data or any of that. But now I'm like, I see teachers doing it and I'm like, oh, why aren't you doing this? Like it makes sense now
Yeah.
when you see other teachers doing things.
Like, I think I kept my data between myself and my para, and
Mm-hmm.
I why? Why did I do that? Why wasn't I sharing more with the students? Why wasn't I sharing more with the parents or the other people that worked with those students? Why did I just have a data binder and then pass it on at the end of the year? There's so many things. So, um, I have all this data now. What do I do? So, first, like the easy answer is to create lessons, right? Like that's typically like the number one answer. Well, I'll use it to create my lessons. But thinking about that, it's not just one data point. So, like as a district, we used iReady, um, but that's just a starting point. Thinking about using those formative assessments and not just using one data point, exit slips, simple like thumbs up, thumbs down, or stand up, sit down, just to get a gauge on how the room is doing, Google Forms, teacher check-ins, but making sure that when we're creating those lessons, that because that's the easy answer, that's what we do. We're not just using like the standardized testing, that the district wide test of whatever it is, whether it's Acadience or iReady or some type of math probe or whatever you're using, but that's just a really basic starting point. You got to add those other pieces in to help support creating those lessons.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to that formative assessments and using that for your lessons, when I first started teaching, I thought I had to take it home. Like I just remember teachers having like a teacher bag and they would throw all the papers from the day in that bag and they would go home and grade it. But by year 3, I got pretty good. And that year I started to grade in front of my students. So as they would turn in their exit ticket, I would do like a quick student conference and I would kind of look it over, circle which ones they got wrong, and then we would have a conversation about it. And I started to see their ownership and their learning go up. I started to also see that students were taking that feedback and using it. Where if I just circled it, it went in a folder somewhere, and who knows where that folder was. Sometimes I'd find them on the ground, right? But it wasn't as meaningful. So having that time where I would leave the last 5-10 minutes, depending on how long the exit ticket was. Now these are like 2 to 3 questions. They're not like a super long test. Where students would conference with me, and as they were conferencing with me, other students, they were working on their exit ticket, and then they were watching or using iReady or maybe watching an Edpuzzle video or completing Prodigy, something like that independently. So that way I could meet with every single student. Also, if I had more than one exit ticket turning in at a time, I was able to kind of maybe pull a small group. So looking over that data and deciding like, hey, this error is common within these 3 students. I'm going to pull all 3 of them back. Or tomorrow, I'm going to pull them back and we're going to start with that. Or maybe as our entrance ticket, this is going to be a focus to see if they took in what we were talking about at that conference.
Yeah, so I think basically what you just said is you're monitoring student progress, right? But then also monitoring teacher progress. When you said like this can help, for the next day, like if you are looking at your exit tickets and you're thinking about, um, did half of the class get this? Did all of the class get this? Do I need to teach this lesson differently? So maybe when you're thinking about creating your lessons, you can use that information to say, okay, last time I taught this and we used a video and we followed it up with a comprehension worksheet and nobody was getting it. So, what are some of the resources I need to change? Or what is some of the language I need to change? Do I need to add vocabulary, decrease vocabulary? Do I need to go back and reteach? What is it that I need to do to teach? So, we oftentimes like, okay, this data means we need to, move in this direction or differentiate for the student. But what do I need to do differently? Is, a great these exit tickets or standardized tests or whatever can help drive and monitor our own progress, not just students.
Yeah, and with that, you've got to bring it up to your team. So most teachers, if you're not self-contained, you have a team of people. Even if you are self-contained, you have a team of people that are with the kids. So if it's special education, it might be that intervention specialist, the guidance counselor. All of these different people should be involved in that data. And I think for me, I'm going to share like a quick story is I was sitting in like a team meeting at our junior highs, and the science teacher, I like created this data binder, which we'll share in a little bit, but he was like, we should use Stephanie's data binder and like customize it for our team. And I was like, one, the science teacher said it, like it wasn't the math teacher. He was like probably all about data. But because he spoke up, and kind of said how he would use it, and then how, like, if we put everything in this online spreadsheet data binder, everybody will be able to have their part in it, and we can see the student as a whole. And I was just so excited because of that teacher and him stepping out to kind of speak up and just say, like, we all need to be on board. And if we're not, then this is going to be a roadblock. And that is true. Sometimes I feel like teachers don't communicate or don't work with other teachers to explain why they want to use a data binder or use something to track student progress. And with that team, he was able to say, like, we're going to be able to kind of see, like, it has all of our personality tests, the executive functioning test. It's got everything in this one spot shop. So if we're having an issue with a partner, that team is now able to bring up that student's data binder and really analyze, hey, they're struggling with this executive functioning skill. They were a orange on the personality test. They were this. Are we giving feedback? Are we doing this to meet that student's needs? So it's not just about the school data. It's about every piece of that child as a whole.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about that as a roadblock later on down the line, but
Mhm.
super important. You talked about sharing amongst your teams, but also sharing with students. Um, Julie Kalinowski, I was a Krasinowski, so I think I'm pretty close on that, how to pronounce her last name. But she's a strategy consultant. She was a former EL student in education. She does this webinar on creating a supporting data-driven culture. And she said when students start taking ownership of their own goals and assessment data, that's when we get the biggest bang for our buck, right? Isn't that so true? When they start to like, we're not only now sharing it with our teams, but we're sharing it with our students. We had that last year where on Monday, the our teacher Ashley Newenschwander, she's amazing in Pickerington. You know, she had her kids looking at data, sending that email home of and monitoring throughout the week. And at the end, did they reach that goal? So they were goal setting based on what their data was, right? Like, can they reach this goal? So then you get into once students understand the data, then we go back to our goal directed persistence, back to that executive functioning skill. Then students are able to set goals for themselves, smart goals that are reasonable, responsible, achievable, attainable, depending on which way you go with your A. But all of those goals then go back to the data. So that helps the student kind of see where they're at and what they need to strive, where they need to strive to go. So sharing data amongst teams, but then sharing data with the students. And that's where I went completely wrong when I was in teaching, that I only shared it with my parapro. I didn't share it with the students' whole team, and I didn't share it with the students. I mean, looking back, like I said, I can't go backwards, but moving forward, thinking about that within the classroom, I've learned so much, going around to all these different schools and different ways to share data, but that's super important for goal setting for students. And I think the more we know, I mean, the better. So just a quick personal story. So it it drives so many things. Like data is all around us all of the time. Using it in a functional based assessment and making sure like the interventions we use behaviorally are data driven. I mean, I used it for medical when I showed up with a chart and a graph of what my drain output was in my fluid to the doctor. They were able to identify that there was a problem on the first day, and I started antibiotics, and they caught that infection early because they identified it really quick because I was monitoring my output of my drain. It's everywhere. Data is all around us, and data driven decisions like I mean, sometimes you just have to go with your gut, right? Like sometimes that's really the way it goes. But there's so many things that we can use data for within our classroom and not make it just another thing because sometimes we feel like it's just another test. It's just another and sometimes it feels like that, right? But there's so many things that we could do with that data that goes beyond it's just another test. And I'm not a testing person. I mean, I don't like standardized tests at all. But different types of data, there's so many things you can do with it.
Yeah, there is so many different things, and I agree, like, adding the students in, I don't know why my first couple years I was scared to do that. I don't know if it was, like, the spec ed, like, confidentiality piece or what, but I didn't share my data with my students, and I took on, like, that's my responsibility, when you are
Yeah.
looking at different data, like, in everyday life, you start to notice patterns. You start to see all these different things. And I was like, oh, I'm seeing this student, and then this is happening, this is happening. But you've got to let go of that control, and it is okay to share their data with them. I think sometimes you can have those really hard conversations, like if they're, a fifth grader and they're reading at maybe a kindergarten level, like that is hard to take in.
Yeah.
Well, I think you can work with the kid to kinda show them, like, different strategies that they're able to do, to help them.
And that brings us like kind of to another topic. I say this is the 3 Ds, right? Data to decide differentiation. So our Ds, data to decide differentiation. So now we have all this data. We've shared it with our teams. We shared it with our students. We've created our lessons. Now we can move forward with like the next piece. How do we differentiate this? Um, could it be their seating? Could it be the way we group them in teams? Could it be we need to get support for this student because we learned through some of their personality tests and they're getting to know you in our data binder that they need some outside support from a school counselor. They have some trauma. What like there's data goes beyond way beyond right the numbers, so data to decide differentiation. What are some ways that you can differentiate stuff that you've come across with when you're thinking about the 3 Ds?
Yeah, when I'm looking at the data, I might use it for different lessons where I use blended learning, and I might have different stations where my students might be at different groups depending on the data or the misconceptions from the exit tickets. I also have used a lot of roadmaps, so like that self-pacing of where students are going to be, and then using that data to kind of decide what can-do options can I have for those early finishers? Is it going to be maybe project-based? Is it going to be this? How am I going to reach those students that might be struggling? And being able to kind of adapt and adjust to that. But I mean, our classrooms, they're very wide with differentiation in today's classroom. And if you are teaching direct instruction, it is difficult to reach every kid that way. And so what I kind of suggest is a mini lesson and then going into some type of blended learning model to differentiate your classes. That way you are using that data. That way you are getting your students in a routine. And if you're unfamiliar or uncomfortable with that new type of learning with blended learning, you can start off very easily where there is no differentiation at first until you get your procedures and your routine in place. And then your next step is to look at that data. So getting those routines and procedures in place is first. And then after you kind of get comfortable, the kids are familiar with the station rotation or how to watch a video or how to use a roadmap or how to do a must do, can do list. There's so many different options that you can do. Once they're familiar with it, once you feel comfortable, that's when you start to pull the data and you start to group your students differently. And that's when you start to pull them for small groups. But again, if you do all of it at once, you're going to feel overwhelmed because it is a lot. So take it slow if this is something that you're interested in trying.
Yeah. And when you start looking at flexible groupings and you think about that the data to decide the differentiation, you can make a choice. Okay, are we differentiating our content, deliberate environment? So which ways are you differentiating based off of your data? You might be able to sit and have a small group and be able to provide them a textbook, or you might have a group or auditory and they are listening to a video or listening. So your differentiation with your data can then look, you know, it could be a choice board, but it could be based on just your that individual group. One group is coming through, they're working on a worksheet. My next group, same content, but maybe they're listening to an audiobook. How are we differentiating? And our data can be what helps drive those decisions when you're organizing your lessons and differentiating.
And some of that comes with the student. So, like, if a student and you're conferencing and you're talking about their data points, hey, you could really benefit from read and write. The student now can take ownership and just click the buttons if you teach them how to do it. And so you don't have to be responsible for, reading everything or doing stuff like that. Like, we can teach these kids how to use different technology tools or different resources in the classroom to start to differentiate on their own as well and use those different accommodations that they might need to be successful in your classroom. And so the last thing we're going to kind of talk about is how do you organize all of these different resources, right? So mm, we've kind of talked about data binders. And for me, again, everybody's different. And that's where Tara and I have so many resources, I think, because we think of everybody or we have so many people that we can kind of help and work through. Last year, I used the website. It was terrible. The kids would go in and like it was a great idea during summer, right? When I'm like creating this awesome website for data binders, but it wasn't practical. The kids were not going in regularly to update their website. Teachers kind of forgot because it wasn't, I don't know, it was a pain, I guess. It was a pain to assign them because you can't just push out a Google Classroom assignment with Google Sites. And so again, it was just a pain for kids to get in them. It was a great start. We got all the kids learned, but then they weren't able to upkeep it. So this year, what we're going to try to do is we are change that to a Google Sheet. And what I love about this Google Sheet is if you look at the show notes, it is going to be overwhelming because it has more tabs than you probably need. And you can delete the tabs you don't need. It's easier to add the tabs. That way they're there if you want them. And then it's easier to delete them. So again, it's there if you want to kind of look it over. But my favorite page is the learner profile, where this is more about the student because I think there's more to a student than just test scores. And on the learner profile, you can look at their personality test. You can look at that executive functioning test, which I absolutely love. And you can look at maybe their Enneagram type or their multiple intelligence or their growth mindset. And you can kind of decide which of these you'll want to use or not use. But looking at all of this on one page is huge because for me, I had some of the information in a Google Sheet again. I had some of it on paper where now the students go into their data binder. It's in Google Classroom. Everybody gets a copy. And now they are in charge of updating it with their different scores. And so now when I'm conferencing with that kid, I just have to pull up their data binder or have the kid pull up their data binder. And I'm able to kind of look over. I can really quickly see what personality they are. So if I see that a student is a blue, when I'm giving them feedback, I want to do that feedback sandwich where I'm saying, this you did really great at. We could improve here, but then follow it up with something that they did really good with again. And so now that I'm able to kind of see, okay, how does that student need feedback? What area with executive functioning is their lowest? So I can support them or help them with resources or strategies to support them with being organized or to help them with figuring out something, maybe it is using an agenda in my classroom. And so again, I'm able to kind of use this data binder to help focus my attention. And then I have like another tab for all of those assessments that we give. So then I do have like an iReady reading. And again, it's just another tab, but I'm able to kind of click through really quickly with that child and have a data chat with them. It's all in this data binder where it's all that one-stop shop. And I'm able to call in conference with them. Other teachers are able to have this as well because it's usually created in a team Google Classroom. So any teacher that is on that list will get added to this data binder. So that can be a great way to have it all in one place. Now, there are people that like paper pencil, and that's completely fine as well. But I would just kind of think about like, how are you using that data? And are you able to streamline it? Or do you need like a cover page? Because I needed a cover page where everything was on that one cover where I had just a quick snapshot of, okay, this is what the student has done or has seen. So that way, when I'm kind of conferencing with kids, I can quickly look over that one pager to meet their needs. You're muted, Tara.
I think this was really important thing that it is not all about just the test, right? That we are looking at those personality tests, those different things that you talked about, because there's so much, like, I'm sure everybody has seen that iceberg image where there's so much that we don't know about a student. So using that, and that's one of our roadblocks. So I have this as a roadblock that, yes, that we can take lots of data, but that's just a snapshot in time. So when we do start like looking at the student profiles, digging a little deeper about the student, maybe there's something that we've identified, like they were doing really good up until sixth grade. And then they had A's and B's. Their grades were on target. They were a good athlete. They were focused in school. Or maybe, they were in the gifted class. And then all of a sudden, they tanked. Um, they're no longer keeping up with the pace of the curriculum. Maybe they're not performing on the field. Maybe their attitude has changed, or they're unmotivated, or maybe it's one of those things. Maybe it's all of those things. Maybe it's none of those things. But thinking about that, we can now look at the pattern, right? So, what happened at that point with that student? So let's dive deeper, by getting to know that student with some of those personality tests, some of those, open conversations that you have with students, all the different ways that we can dive in deeper than just a data point, because that is a data point, right? Like, to me, that's a social emotional data point that we really didn't talk about. We talked about all academic data points, but social emotional data points are very valuable. What happened in the seventh grade, social emotionally, that they are now struggling, and how do we get that student support to get them back on task? So I think thinking about that as well, you look at your academic data, but then you think also about the social emotional data points. And they were doing really well, all of a sudden seventh grade they're struggling. Are they being, bullied? Are they having friendship problems? Is something going on in social media? Is there different things that could be happening socially? I mean, bullied is a big word, so probably not that. We don't talk about that as often as we do some of these other social emotional needs for our students. But taking all of that into account and making sure that you talk about that as a team, and that we kind of take that into perspective, and have some type of student profile so that other teachers, maybe they can connect with them, or that empathy piece, where we might need to talk differently to a student if they've experienced trauma. And that's one of our social emotional data points that we can support a student to help them grow. Because if we can help solve those problems or get them support, so maybe if it is a social media data point that we've taken that is a struggle for a student, we might be able to help them solve it. Or if there is trauma, we might be able to help get them support. So now taking those data points and supporting the student as well and looking at the whole child's data, like not just the academic piece.
Yeah, I completely agree with looking at everything. I know for me, I had a student whose father passed away. I think he was like in the second grade and I was a fifth grade teacher. And just looking over his iReady data, you saw a huge drop in second grade. And then when you put those two pieces together, you're able to understand the why that happened. And it just makes more sense and provides more clarity. And I just wish sometimes, I think the state of Ohio or the state of all of these different assessments would take that piece into more consideration, because it does affect our social emotional, can affect the way that we test on certain days or the way that we respond to different situations. So I just felt for that kid when I saw that, because if you're just looking at that test result, you're just like, oh, what happened? But if you know the story behind the data, it can be really life changing.
Yeah. So knowing the story behind the data, that's a great takeaway here. So it's not just what do I do with this data, but it's knowing the story behind the data and um, and moving on from there to how we can support all the needs of the student. So, your call to action this week: like, share, comment, leave us a review on our episode. This is our last episode of August. Next week, we're excited to have a guest talking about adventure trips, which is very interesting. It's PBIS in a different way. PBIS stands for her school, which she'll tell us about. I kind of let that leak a little bit. Sorry about that. But PBIS in a different way, and adventure trips next week. So join us next week. And until next time, control the chaos.
Thanks for listening to Control the Chaos EDU. Check out the description for show notes.
We look forward to connecting with you on social media. Subscribe to the weekly podcast so you never miss an episode. Control the chaos. Until next time.